record here, and I think you'll hear it on your end too, right?
Yeah, I did.
Awesome. Okay. So I guess my first question is, as I've started to interview more and more religious studies people, just out of a personal interest, I found that there's a very interesting dichotomy that might serve us to start with between sort of people who approach religious studies from a secular perspective and those who sort of approach it from a religious perspective.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, in sort of reading your bio, if maybe you'll enter in a third perspective that I haven't really interacted with yet.
Yeah.
But I'm curious how you would answer that question.
Yeah, I think it's a real division, or a real conversation, I would say, in the field. I think it's a very healthy conversation. I don't think there's any study of religion without secularism, by the way. I think secularism made possible the study of religion, and so I value it, and I use all kinds of, I think, what most people would perceive as secular critical methods. Having said that, I'm most interested in the study of religion that take the religious dimension as real, frankly, but not as literal. I guess that there is a third space here.
Yeah.
I'm most interested in people studying religion who think something real is happening, but are not going to sign their names to the particular religion or the particular doctrine. And that's certainly where I'm at. It's a both and approach, as I call it.
Interesting. I'm fascinated. You said secularism made possible the study of religion. I think I can start to feel that out, but what exactly do you mean there?
Well, if you look at the people who founded the discipline in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries, they often ended their lives or spent a lot of their lives in prison, or they were fired, or they experienced all kinds of censorship or harassment. Religions are not very good at asking the kinds of questions scholars of religion really want to ask. To put it mildly, we're interested in questions of sexuality and gender and race and class and history, and how scriptural texts are edited and put together, and essentially how religious experience is constructed by historical and psychological and social processes. And so that's not exactly popular with people who take their religions as themselves. And I would say, the bottom line is intellectuals who study religion think religion is constructed. It's a something that happens to us in the course of a life, where religious people think we're born particularly religious, or we're born with a particular religion, and scholars of religion are like, no, you're not. You're born a human being, and you learn to be a particular religious identity. The religious identity is constructed. It's not given to you at birth. And so that's really the fundamental difference, I think. And secularism, as a political organization, allowed the study of religion because it separated the authority of the religion from the nation state, essentially. In cultures in which the religious authority is the nation state, you don't have the study of religion. It's not allowed. It's suppressed. In cultures where religious faith and national identity is separated, you have the study of religion, because religious identity is not prioritized or privileged in any particular political way.
Interesting.
So, for example, I'll give you an example. I mean, it's obvious, simple example. Take the US. The Constitution clearly separates church and state. Regardless of what people want to say, the Constitution clearly separates them. That gives people the freedom to be religious in all kinds of ways that they could not be in Europe, by the way, in the 17th or 18th century. So it allows for a much more diverse and robust religiosity, but it also takes away the political power of a particular religious tradition so that they can all flourish. So secularism doesn't mean no religion. It can actually mean even more religion. But it can also mean no religion. I mean, it meant no religion in the Soviet Union. It meant no religion in Maoist China, but it's meant more religion in the US. So secularism it's a complicated thing, and there are different forms of it. But I don't think you get the study of religion without it, because the religions will suppress the study of religion.
Interesting. And so it sounds like that original dichotomy that I posed, sort of religious versus secular, how has that affected maybe your studies, where you're going to bump up against the earliest foundational scholars of religion are going to be within that religion itself, right?
Yes. So even today, even today, I don't want to give numbers because I don't know the numbers. I don't know statistics, but I would say most of the people I interact with began in a religious tradition, and they were super religious, but they had questions that their religious traditions would not allow them to ask, much less answer. And so they end up leaving those traditions and they back into the academy or the university or college. It wasn't as if they were born saying, I want to be a professor of religion. Again, no kid does that. It's a weird kid. Yeah. Don't trust that kid. But people do back into the field because it's the only space, the only social space in the culture that allows one to spend one's life asking these questions and not being obedient to a particular religious tradition.
Interesting. And I'm going to ask you to generalize here, but I'm interested in breaking down sort of this subset, this dichotomy into subsets. These people that are asking these questions and have backed into the institution, or backed into the academy rather, what do you think is, in your experience, the motivating factor to ask those questions? Is it, are they sort of upset about the tradition that they were handed and saying, like, I wasn't allowed to ask this question, and now there's a guy, I think I get the sense with, I don't know if you're familiar with Bart Ehrman.
Oh, sure.
But I get the sense with Bart Ehrman that a lot of his, at least his early career, seemed like he was trying, he seemed upset almost at the things he was told as he was discovering how untrue they probably were.
No, I mean, I think a lot of us are or were upset. And I think that being upset is entirely justified. And it's an intellectual and spiritual response to somebody trying to essentially bullshit us.
Sure.
And it's just honesty. It's just honesty. It's just a kind of spiritual and intellectual integrity that wants to know what happened, wants to know the truth of whatever the question is. It might be, again, about race. It might be about sexuality or gender. It might be about a scriptural text. But the person just wants to know. They want to ask those questions, and they want answers. And when we're essentially not told, or the question is actively avoided or suppressed, people get upset for obvious reasons. And secularism allows us to move on and to go outside the religious tradition. We couldn't do that 500 years ago in Europe, by the way. People who did that 500 years ago were in physical danger. People who do that now are in no physical danger. In the US, they could be in physical danger, by the way, in other cultures. So it's, as I like to say, I mean, I don't like to say this, but it's true. The study of religion is the most dangerous enterprise that goes on in the university. I mean, you are deconstructing people's identities and people's families and people's lives in a really clear way. And it's really tricky. I don't want to underestimate how difficult and tricky it is, because I deal with students every day or every week of my professional life. I mean, I know how tricky it is. I work with these young people, and they are asking questions, and they're asking very similar questions that I asked 40 years ago, whenever that was. I'm old now. But I remember being young. I remember that. So I think it's, to answer your question, I think it's just about intellectual and spiritual honesty and integrity. People want to know. The other thing I'll say, here's another thing that's even, I think, deeper. One of the things you learn about religions is that they all began with people separating from their family religions. Religions don't develop out of peace and light and, hugs. They develop out of fights and debates and questions, and people separate from their cultures. This idea that religion is friendly to one's culture or family is just kind of nonsense, at least at the beginning of these religions. Later on, yes, but certainly in their beginnings, these are often reform movements or revolutionary movements or prophetic movements that stand directly against the tradition or faith or family tradition that the person was born with.
You reminded me of the quote, and I'm sure you're familiar with it. I don't know who to attribute it to, but something about the margins giving us insight. And it's from, if I might be butchering this, but it's from I think it's something like it's from the desert that we get the prophets, not the temple.
Yeah. Unfortunately, well, you get them actually from both. Prophets come from temples too. But we have an approach at Rice University to the study of religion. I call it margins at the center. And what I mean by that, it's really at the margins that change comes and that the tradition is challenged. And so we're interested in general in religious movements that were suppressed or were marginal. So Gnostic, esoteric, and mystical traditions didn't do so well, by the way, particularly in Europe and the West. But these are the ones I think, well, certainly I'm the most interested in because they tell us something very important about the cultures and about these human beings that I think is quite remarkable. Orthodoxy is important. It's really important to study as well. You don't get margins without a center. But orthodoxy changes, by the way, from century to century, millennium to millennium. It's not stable either.
Right. But it often, and I'm not an expert, but it often appears and seems to argue that it is stable. Right. So then it has
it's not
right, but it has this difficult thing to sort of contend with where how do you square that circle where you say, orthodoxy is the sort of one true thing, and then it's like, but it changes over time.
Well, so I grew up in an Orthodox tradition. I grew up Roman Catholic, and I was told lots of things about the stability and the ancient nature of the faith that are simply not true. But you actually don't know they're not true until you study other religions.
Sure.
And so I think that's why scholars of religion are so dangerous or so problematic for so many people, is that they stand outside those traditions and they say things like I just said, that no, orthodoxy is not stable, and no, this is not true. I mean, people don't want to hear that. They want to hear their faith was always that so, and it hasn't ever changed, and it simply isn't so. Simply isn't so.
You said earlier that religions are real, but not literal, or that what you appreciate about them is whatever is real about them, but not literal.
Yeah,
I think I might be misquoting you a little bit.
Yeah, no, that's okay. You can misquote me.
What is that real part? When I listen back to the tape, I'll laugh at myself, and however I just butchered that. But what is that real part that interests you?
The actual answer is I don't know. I don't think we can know either. If you want a one-word answer for what that real part is, I would say consciousness. But I don't think we can think consciousness. I don't think Kevin and Jeff can sit here and talk about consciousness and say anything reasonably accurate. I think consciousness is just consciousness. It's awareness. It's present. It's what you and I are in right now. But we can't measure it. We can't replicate it. We can't. It's not an object. It's actually a subject. It's you. It's me. So I'll give you a concrete example. So people who have had near-death experiences often talk to me a lot, and they'll tell me about the vision of the other world and the afterlife, and some kind of out-of-body experience, and often all kinds of paranormal abilities that reveal themselves after such a near-death experience. And they all, pretty much down to the last one, think that what they saw and experienced is actually what the afterlife is. And I have to say to them, look, I know you think or believe that, but this person over here thinks or believes something different. And this person over here thinks or believes something, because they had a different near-death experience. So clearly, what we call the imagination is functioning in these experiences, and it's forming and shaping them in specific ways. I think you actually did experience what comes after life, but I think it was filtered or mediated by your own cultural and psychological and social imagination. So that's what I mean. That's what I call the both and. It's like, yeah, you definitely contacted something very real, but that real can only speak in symbols and myths and stories. It cannot speak directly to us. It's like, you want another metaphor. So it's like the fisherman floating on the ocean. He can't speak to the fish. No matter what he does, he cannot speak to them. He cannot he can catch them, he can let them go. He can, I suppose, even eat them, but he cannot speak to them. So that's what I mean by that both and, or that it's real, but a comparativist like myself takes these things as real, but not literally. That's what I meant by the phrase.
Interesting.
And Kevin, I mean, so again, that's a moral position, because I'm taking everybody's near-death experiences seriously. If you want me to believe yours, I've got to dismiss all these others.
Yeah.
Well, I can't do that.
Right.
I can't do that because it's not plausible to me. Why would I do that?
Yeah.
Because you say so?
Right.
Because you experienced
Right.
the afterlife.
You have to believe me, Jeff.
Yeah, I mean, come on. So, but I recognize that these people had profound experiences that were life-changing. And I do think consciousness can only speak to us, in the symbols and myths of our own making and of our own understanding. I don't think it can speak to us directly.
Interesting. I have a million questions that I think I could ask that would make me sound really woo-woo. But I'll just tiptoe.
This is woo-woo, by the way. Woo-woo is real, by the way.
Let me just tiptoe into that space a little bit. You said something about you do think some people that you talked to that had these near-death experiences or did in fact die. I don't actually know the details of these situations, but you said that they filter whatever they experience through their own,
I don't think they do that consciously, by the way, Kevin.
Well, my question was, my guess is that we all go to the same place or not place after death, right?
Mm-hmm.
So is it the individualism of that recounting? Is that when they kind of come back into it, they have to think about the same way that if we could all somehow dream the same dream, we might all talk about it differently because we had different experiences?
So first of all, we all wake up from our dreams, right?
Right.
But we dream differently. And it's that both and again that I'm trying to recognize. I don't think these people consciously shape or mediate their experiences. I think something, the whole for me, the definition of a true religious or a genuine religious experience is that it's given. There isn't an actual conscious human agency involved. It presents itself to the person as already established, as given. And this is what people don't understand about extreme religious experience. They think these people are making this up. They're not making it up. Sorry, they're not. But something as or in them is in fact constructing it in such a way. And one of the metaphors I always use is a stained glass window, I grew up with in this little town in Nebraska is, the sun's the sun, the light's the light, but it's shining through these windows, and those windows, guess what, were constructed by an artist and with lead and glass, and they're telling stories that are based on scriptural texts that were also written by human beings. It's a very specific mythology that's being told in the stained glass windows, but the sun's a sun, and it's going to shine through into the Muslim mosque and into the Hindu temple and the Jewish synagogue. It's going to be the same sun, but it's going to be an entirely different mythology or narrative. So that's too simple, Kevin, but that's essentially what I'm talking about. Is those people need a story, they need something to live inside of, but that story is not universally shared.
But it sounds like, if I'm going to follow that analogy through, that while the story isn't universally shared, it sounds like you're sort of describing a common well water that all religions tap into. Is that
Yeah,
too
I
far?
am. I am. So we call this perennialism in the study of religion, that there's some kind of core. I'm actually not a perennialist, and we can talk about why that is, but I do think there's a base or a fundamental reality behind all this, and that's what I call consciousness. I'll give you another example. I co-wrote a book with a woman named Elizabeth Crone, who was struck by lightning in the parking lot of her synagogue in 1988.
Wow.
And had a very elaborate near-death experience, and then developed all kinds of paranormal abilities afterwards.
Huh.
And, Elizabeth and I talked for years about this, and we wrote this book together. And basically what Elizabeth says is that everyone gets the near-death experience they need or they want. The phrase I use in the book is, we die into our imaginations. But I don't think those imaginations are permanent. And I don't think Elizabeth thinks that either. I think there is something beyond these near-death experiences, or beyond these cultural imaginations, that is even more real. And I think that's what we can't talk about, because it's not about words, it's not about culture or descriptions. It's something else entirely.
Yeah.
So I don't know, that's just another way of talking about this. But Elizabeth is really clear that if you or I have a near-death experience, we're not going to see what she saw. We're not going to experience that, because that's not what we need to see or experience. We'll see or experience something different. And so she operates with a very sophisticated kind of comparative understanding that the near-death experience is real, but it's also mediating what the person needs to hear or see.
I have a few questions in one particular direction. Some of this is starting to remind me of, as a very casual person who's interested casually in these things, speaking to someone who's very serious about these things. This starts to remind me of like what I've read of Joseph Campbell.
Yeah.
And I think he has is it Zimmer, I think, was his friend, who has this quote that's like it's like the best things we can't talk about, the second best things, we can only imagine, but we don't have the words for. And it's like something like the third best things are what we actually talk about.
So Heinrich Zimmer was a German Indologist, and Joseph Campbell was an American mythologist. And I know quite a bit about each person. Campbell wrote this book called A Hero with a Thousand Faces, and his basic argument was that human beings tell different stories. They tell thousands of stories, actually, but they're all rooted in the body and in its biological and instinctual needs. So he was a pretty sophisticated Freudian and Jungian at the same time. He saw myth as speaking accurately about the human condition, but of course also not literally. It's not clear to me if Campbell had some kind of transcendence in mind. I kind of doubt it, just having read him a lot. I do have transcendence in mind. I don't think it's just about the body. I think the body's temporary, and I don't think consciousness is restricted to a human body. I think it's it's in animals, it's in plants, it's in the whole universe.
Interesting.
So I don't associate consciousness with the brain or the human body. And I sometimes wonder if Campbell did. I don't know that. I don't want to speak for him.
Yeah.
But his thought was incredibly important. He also talked about what he called the hero's journey, which was a particular structure of myth that you find in all different cultures. And he was very influential in Hollywood, by the way, as well. A young man named George Lucas
Sure.
picked up on Campbell and created Star Wars, frankly, largely out of Campbellian hero myth themes. So Joe Campbell had a tremendous influence on American popular culture through Lucas. And then Bill Moyers interviewed him and did a series called The Power of Myth, and essentially made him famous. But he died.
Yeah.
Like most authors and intellectuals, they die before their thought really gets taken up and they don't get to see it. And I think Campbell was seeing it right as he saw Star Wars. Star Wars came out before he died, but I don't know his dates, but he dies right around or before the Moyers comes out.
Yeah, I think within 2 years, I think.
Yeah, we can look it up, but it's right around there. Campbell was also really influential at a retreat center I've studied and written about and participated in called the Esalen Institute. So I actually know quite a bit about Joe Campbell. I know some of his friends, and I've written about him as well. And super, super important individual for this history. But I'm not saying what he's saying, Kevin, to answer your question. I think it's related, but it's somewhat different.
He's something of a hero of mine. There's no pun intended there.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. Well, good. Yeah.
He does
that's your introduction to the study of religion.
I think everybody, well, at least in my experience, my introduction to the study of religion was my own religious upbringing.
Oh, okay. What was that, by the way?
That was Roman, sort of cultural
Roman Catholicism. Yeah.
But and so was Campbell's, which was sort of permissive in a way, which was very inviting, I think. Yeah. But he has this interesting lecture to answer one of your thoughts there about sort of like Kantian and I guess Kantian metaphysics in relation to his idea of consciousness. And it sounds like Campbell at some point in his life started to question it sounds like where you were headed with this, sort of like the consciousness of plants and the consciousness of animals. And I think there's like that Kantian thing where if I drop this pen, it knows exactly where the ground is, that kind of thing. And I think that Campbell was really interested in like, all right, well, there are parts of us that seem really mechanistic, where if we don't attribute consciousness to like the heliotropism of plants, what do we say about our bodily functions, where if we cut our, if we get a scrape or something and the cells rush to that, and the white blood cells and the clotting, whatever, all these sort of mechanisms sort of take place in our body. It sounded like Campbell was really interested in the mechanistic nature of other plants and animals, and it seemed like he was rather agnostic as to whether or not that was consciousness.
Yeah, I don't know, actually. I don't know. I just don't know enough about Campbell to say. The Kantian stuff is important to the academy. It's the basic idea in Kant that comes through the academy is that you can never know the real as such. It always appears to you through what he called the a priori categories of things like space and time and causality, that these are sort of inbuilt into the human brain or mind, and we filter everything through these categories, but we can't actually see or experience reality as it really is. And there's a part of that I agree with, but there's also a part of that I profoundly disagree with, because a lot of the traditions I've studied do say you can experience reality as such. it's just not going to appear as language or as an image or a symbol or a metaphor. You're going to experience consciousness as consciousness. You're going to be being. So I do disagree with the basic Kantian notion that a human being can't know the real as real. But I think, generally speaking, he's absolutely correct that what people experience is an appearance and not the actual thing. That's usually true, but not always. And so my own method is essentially to look at people's extraordinary experiences, certainly to treat them as phenomena, as appearances, but to suggest that they do tell us something about the nature of reality. So it's it's not Kantian, but it certainly, I hope, honors what Kant was saying or trying to say.
I hope you don't mind jumping around a little bit, but I'm so fascinated by how many really interesting esoteric things you're interested in.
Yeah.
But I'm also fascinated in sort of the origin of those thoughts. And you mentioned that you were raised Roman Catholic, but
yeah,
I think I know that your first book was about Hinduism.
yeah,
I'm really interested in that jump, right?
yeah,
And
yeah.
do you happen to remember what some of the first questions were that you were asking that started to get you in trouble?
Oh,
that
sure.
maybe
Of
backed
course.
you into this whole thing?
Of course.
Yeah.
I've written about them. This is all public knowledge because they're in my books.
Hmm.
I mean, all of my early questions were around male sexual orientation. And I wanted to know why so many people who wanted to be priests or monks were gay. That was, and I say that with great affection. It wasn't a moral judgment. It was like, what's going on here? Because, I was a confused, essentially straight kid, but I recognized that sexual orientation is actually pretty fluid and malleable. And I was so struck by, I had been raised Roman Catholic, and I had sort of heard all this condemnation, really, of male homosexuality, a kind of homophobic pathologization of it, really, from the church. But when I got to the seminary, it was, in on the inside of the church, this was basically a flamboyant club of closeted gay men, basically. And I don't mean that they were acting out. I don't think they were, for the most part. I think they were very genuine and were trying to transform or sublimate this into a religious life, and we're doing it really well, frankly. But I couldn't do that because I had nothing to sublimate. I was like, oh wow, I actually don't love men the same way I love women. And so that was the big question I had. And I decided after many years that there actually was no place in the mystical traditions, at least for a man who was heterosexually oriented. You could be a heretic. You could be William Blake or Teilhard de Chardin or Jakob Böhme or something and get, expelled from the center of the tradition. But you couldn't represent the tradition in a heterosexual mode, because you needed a female deity, by the way, to do that. And that's a big problem in the West. So I got interested in Hinduism because of that. There are lots of goddesses, by the way, in Hinduism, and I wanted to see whether it worked out differently. And I concluded it didn't. That Orthodoxy is always going to privilege a kind of sublimated male homosexuality or queerness, to use a more contemporary term, and that straight people are going to be expelled from it, and they're going to end up in the margins or in the heresies. So that's still what I think, Kevin. That's a hard message for people to hear, but it's I think it's the historical truth.
Interesting.
So that's what it wasn't a jump from Catholicism to Hinduism. It was a natural kind of progression, and it was just trying to ask a question in different cultural contexts, because I wanted to see what was culture and what was more common or more a part of our humanity.
So what was culture and what was sort of more elemental or innate? Or
I think there's a kind of psychosexuality that gets linked to spirituality and religious vocation that's much more basic than culture. And I think there's
Interesting.
something really special about queerness, by the way.
Hmm.
I think queerness is sacred and often accesses reality in a way that straightness can't or does not. I think we're pretty dull. I mean, I can't speak for you, Kevin. I'm pretty dull. And being straight, what happens to heterosexuality is it gets canalized into the social system. You know, you have children and you get a job and you uphold society, but you don't become one with God, or you don't develop a religious vocation. You're expelled from the religious vocation. And so I don't know else. I just said that. I just spilled the beans, I guess. But I've spilled the beans many times. So
Yeah, you'll excuse my facial reactions. I've just never thought any of these things before ever in my life.
yeah, well, there
But
you go.
but um, I have thought some interesting things that might be not as tangential to the things you're thinking as I might have expected at first. But
So
can I pick some of these things apart?
yeah,
And I
yeah.
obviously need to go read this book.
Well, there are many books, but I mean, let me just say one other thing before you pick it apart or pick at it. You know, when I describe these ideas in the abstract, people look at me and they're like, "Wow, you are one crazy dude." But when I explain the ideas in the context of my life, they're like, "Wow, that makes a lot of sense." I then they start thinking about experiences in their own lives and ideas or thoughts they had, and they're generally quite struck by it, and quite moved, frankly, because it's actually a pretty profound set of ideas, and it's a kind of warm embrace of queerness that I think they're not always expecting.
Yeah.
Um, so anyway,
So I have all sorts of questions about, and this isn't necessarily that I disagree with. I don't know if I understand it enough to disagree with it yet, but I'm going to just assume some of the premises because I can start to see a little bit of a through line with your experience at the seminary. You said something about being sort of like straightness being expelled from the mystical tradition, and excuse
yeah,
my paraphrase.
no, that's what I said.
But then it sounds like you sort of came to an understanding of why that was when you said
Yeah,
something like we're quite dull.
yeah, yeah.
So I guess I'm really interested in I I again I have all sorts of foundational questions like do we have any sense, and I'm sure this is really hard to measure, of like what number of people go
Mhm.
into these traditions that could
Yeah,
be
we did.
labeled as
Yeah,
gay or queer or
yeah.
however you're using those words?
So we did we certainly had statistics from sociologists of religion when I was writing about these things in the 90s. I don't know what the statistics are now. I haven't followed this conversation for a long
Hmm.
time, Kevin. But certainly in the 90s, the rates range from 30 to about 80% of seminarians would self-identify as gay or as same-sex. And we also knew that cross-culturally, about 11 or 12% of individuals in any culture would be same-sex oriented. So the numbers were either 3 times or 8 times what you would expect if it was random. So it's not random at all.
Hmm.
Celibacy, in particular, in Catholicism, selects, at least in the 80s, for homosexuality or a queer orientation, and the reason is very simple. If you're a queer, gay or queer Catholic male in 1980, not now, I'm not talking about now, in 1980, you don't have any real social options. Any place in society in which you're going to express yourself queerly, you're going to be condemned.
Hmm.
But if you join the church and become a priest or a monk or a celibate, you will be praised and you will get all kinds of cultural rewards for that. And you'll also get to live with other men. And by the way, worship a divine man. And so there are all kinds of ways that affirm your spiritual sexuality through celibacy. And so I'm not questioning those. I'm just trying to understand those and affirm those. And there's nothing in society that can help you. Now, today it's different because there's much less taboo around the topic. And I suspect more men are just simply living in society as queer men. And thankfully so. I'm happy about that. But I think that's going to have an impact on religious vocation.
Interesting.
So that's kind of where I went with that thought. And my latest work, Kevin, it's actually not about sexuality at all. It's about the paranormal. But in some ways it is about sexuality. And the way I put it is I spent that first half of my life queering religion, and I'm going to spend the second half of my life weirding religion. I'm always interested in what doesn't fit in. And I'm not suggesting that homosexuality fits into Roman Catholicism. It doesn't officially. It's still pathologized. It's still condemned, particularly by the Pope that just passed away, by the way, Pope Benedict, but not Francis. Francis has a much looser and I think much more accurate and realistic vision of sexual orientation in the priesthood. And I'm not sure he'll win that debate, but he's my kind of guy, by the way. He's Francis knows. And well, but that doesn't mean again that the church as a whole will side with Francis versus Benedict. I hope it does on that particular issue. I really do. But I don't know that. And I gave up. By the way, I gave up on the tradition, Kevin. I don't have time. I mean, life is short, and I'm not going to sit here and wait around for the church to catch up with this. It's because it's not going to catch up. It might happen in 100 years, but it ain't going to happen tomorrow.
At the Esalen Institute, so what does a straight person do who's really interested in mystical thoughts?
Yeah. Well,
what communities do you join? I mean, I guess I want to revisit like what that limitation actually looks like that you were describing earlier. So like, why is it exactly in your estimation that there's a mystical limitation to straightness?
Yeah, because your psychosexuality, the energies get canalized by society into procreation and work and family. And your psychosexuality, your energies are not sublimated into the religious life and into prayer and meditation and liturgy and things like that. I mean, it's very much a Freudian reading or a post-Freudian reading that, look, we only have so much life energy, and that's either going to get used into these social ends or it's going to get used into these religious ends, and it can't do both. Now, having said that, Kevin, I don't believe that straight people can't have mystical experiences. Of course, that's ridiculous. They have them all the time. But they tend to have them outside Orthodox traditions, and they tend to have them in very traumatic moments. So like near-death experiences or illnesses or life events that don't have to do with Orthodoxy. That's essentially my argument. Because straight guys are part of the same reality that queer people are part of. It's the same reality. It's the same consciousness. It's the same God. So of course we can experience that too, but not within the parameters of the religious traditions in general.
When did you come to Gnosticism? It's interesting that you would go to Hinduism first, right?
Yeah.
When did you sort of return to the non-canonical?
Well, I got expelled from the study of Hinduism. You don't say these things and remain popular with people. So in the 90s, I was the poster boy for the harassed and censored and condemned scholar. And I got interested in the Esalen Institute and the counterculture, the American counterculture, because essentially the founder or the co-founder of Esalen, a man named Michael Murphy, read my work on Hinduism and was just kind of blown away by it in a positive sense, which of course is how I intended it. It's very positive, ecstatic writing. And he invited me out there, and I got, over the years, it took about 3 or 4 years, I realized that, wow, the whole counterculture is a whole different zone. It's filled with people of all types. It's not bound to the religions, and it hasn't really received any scholarly attention that I wanted to give it. And so I spent 6 or 7 years writing this big book called Esalen America and the Religion of No Religion. And I looked at these kind of post-Christian secular forms of spirituality that ran through the counterculture and through the Esalen Institute. And that's at the same time I got really interested in Gnosticism, because Gnosticism was essentially a spirituality that developed in the Mediterranean world in the first few centuries of the Common Era, and it itself was expelled and condemned and repressed in ways that I felt were very similar to the American counterculture. And I felt that scholars of religion in particular often inhabit Gnostic positions, and that this comparative study of religion really came out of the American counterculture. It did not come out of these previous cultural moments that people think that it did. At least in the States, it came out of the 60s and 70s, and often, frankly, psychedelics and the devotional attitude towards Asian gurus and lamas and roshis. And so I was trained to do all that. I was trained to think about all those Asian traditions, and I wanted to think about how these young Americans picked up on all of this in the 60s and 70s, and how rock and roll and psychedelics and Asian religions all kind of came together. So that's how I got there. It was actually very organic again, Kevin. It wasn't a leap. It was pretty natural development.
Interesting. And that book is called Esalen America?
Well, it depends on which book. So the book on the counterculture is called Esalen.
Esalen, sorry.
And the subtitle is America and the Religion of No Religion. Again, secularism, but a kind of secularism that's mystical and that allows for all kinds of different religious orientation. And then at the same time, I wrote a book called The Serpent's Gift, Gnostic Reflections on the Study of Religion. And that's this argument that scholars of religion inhabit Gnostic positions. And, it works from the Garden of Eden myth or story. And it basically says, the hero is the snake. the nasty character is actually God in that story, who's trying to prevent this young couple from knowledge, and it's the snake who's giving them knowledge. And so, it's a playful kind of reading of that story. And like, look, scholars of religion are basically the snake, and we're going to get in trouble with this God, and of course we do. So that's what I mean by Gnosticism. It's a kind of direct knowing of one's own divinity and one's own reality that gets into a lot of trouble and stands against the God of the traditions.
Huh. Wow, this is fascinating. And what is the Esalen Institute actually do, and what is when you go there, what does that look like?
Yeah. Well, okay. So it started in 1962. And the answer is it's been many things. At the Esalen Institute, it's a different institute every decade. It started before the counterculture in 62. The counterculture really gets going in about 64. And its earliest interests were in psychedelics and religion. And the question was not legal. These substances were not illegal in 1962. The question was, how does one experience God on a mushroom or on a human-made molecule like LSD? How is that even possible? And of course, it is possible. It happens all the time. But the question was, well, how does that relate to these religious traditions that claim you have to believe X, Y, or Z, or you have to, have perform such and such a ritual. And it was also really interested in Asia, particularly Hinduism and Buddhism and Taoism. And it became one of the nodes. Esalen was really one of the mecca points for the hippies in the American counterculture in the 60s and early 70s. And then in the 70s and 80s, it became something else, the 90s and 2000s and so on. My first trip there was in 98. And I sit on the board now. So I'm not a neutral voice, Kevin. So I'm not speaking as a historian or someone neutral anymore. I'm speaking as someone who really believes in the place and is trying to nurture the place. And the basic idea there is that no one captures the flag. There is no one teacher or one doctrine that gets to hold the Institute. It's a sort of an experiment. It's a long experiment for different teachers and different practices to come in and to work with people. And so there's two levels of Esalen. There's the public programming, which anybody can sign up for, and then there's what's called the CTR, the Center for Theory and Research, which is the dimension I help direct. And it's about 6 to 8 meetings every year that are entirely private and that are invitation only. And that's not because we're snobs, it's because we're often talking about things that are difficult, and privacy and confidentiality serve the conversation. And those themes are usually of a parapsychological or of a ecological or a diplomatic nature. So there's a strong element of Russian American diplomacy, by the way, that's been there since the early 70s. There's a very strong parapsychological element around the survival of bodily death and paranormal abilities. And there's a very strong ecological or environmental sensibility there that's been there for, again, 40, 50 years. So it's kind of stood for things that are now coming into the public in a pretty dramatic way, but they've been on that side for a long time.
Interesting. I want to ask you about your mission of weirding religious studies in a second, but before I do, does the book The Immortality Key does that mean anything to you, Brian?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Because I know that, and I think Charlie Stang is also on the board.
Yeah, he is. Charlie's on our board.
And I think he does some work with
Charlie and I basically run the Center for Theory and Research together.
Okay.
With the co-founder, Michael Murphy.
Oh, wow.
And I know Brian well. I mean, I blurbed that book, and that book is a really powerful example of the kinds of ideas that were talked about at Esalen in the 60s, but were not yet developed in the same way. Brian's book is really the kind of the furthest or the most contemporary development of a set of ideas that have been around for 30 or 40 years.
Yeah. Interesting. Brian
he says new things. Don't get me wrong. It's not.
Yeah.
I mean, there are so many things about Brian's book that are important, but one of them is his use of things like archaeochemistry and sort of new scientific methods that can figure out what these people were drinking or eating in a way that we could only speculate before with texts.
Yeah.
But it turns out the speculations were basically correct. So, Brian gives us a reason to think these things in a way that the scholarship on ancient texts and psychedelics had suggested or hypothesized, but couldn't actually establish.
So it sounds like you were already, though you didn't necessarily have the archaeochemical proof, you were already on board with some of those findings and their implications of Christian history and
absolutely. I mean, I don't know about specific cases. I mean, those are always speculative, but the idea that the history of religions is based on altered states, I think is just so obvious it isn't even worth talking about. I mean, it's like, duh. And that human beings have been adjusting things forever. I mean, duh. I mean, it's just like, oh my God, that's so obvious. Can't we just accept that? I mean, do you think human beings haven't been eating magic mushrooms for hundreds of thousands? Come on, just wake up, you know? I mean, so I just, oh my gosh. And, you know, human beings we seek out altered states.
Hmm.
You know, even if it's through something like alcohol or coffee, which is what I'm drinking now. These
Sure.
are drugs.
Yeah.
These are psychoactive substances. And it's what human beings do. So stop it. Just stop the nonsense. And so that's kind of my attitude towards that.
Yeah. Interesting. That reminds me of Michael Pollan's, I think
Oh,
it's Your Mind on Plants.
oh yeah.
Yeah.
Michael's great.
Yeah.
I know Michael Pollan, and I've read How to Change Your Mind, and
Hmm.
I'm absolutely on board. I think, yep, that's it.
So I want to be mindful of your time, but I'm really interested in your latest endeavor and interests in paranormal, and I'm sure that's not the right word, but your interest in UFOs, and I like your
Yeah,
branding of sort of weirding
yeah,
things up.
yeah.
Do you have a second to maybe introduce me to that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I talk a lot about what I call the impossible. And the reason I like that phrase is it, first of all, it makes people comfortable. They're uncomfortable with paranormal, by the way,
Sure.
for reasons I think are not justified.
Interesting.
The term was, the paranormal was coined in French in 1903 by a professional lawyer and psychologist, and by the name of Joseph Maxwell. And paranormal meant essentially something that was natural, part of the world, but we didn't yet understand scientifically. And I think that's a perfectly good framing of what's going on. I have no trouble with it. I actually love the word paranormal because it's cool.
Yeah.
People like it.
Especially
some people,
with the French accent. It sounds very cool.
paranormal. Yeah. I mean, but it does make intellectuals and scientists nervous. I'm like, okay, so let's talk about the impossible. The impossible is not impossible at all. And what I try to argue intellectually is that actually what you consider impossible is just a function of your assumptions. That reality is doing weird stuff all the time that doesn't fit into your model. These things are impossible in your framework, but they're actually not impossible at all. And the model, or the story I always tell is, you know, the French countryside in the 1700s, where farmers kept telling the city intellectuals that rocks were falling from the sky and burning up in their fields. And the intellectuals were like, that is the dumbest thing I've ever heard.
Sure.
Rocks cannot fall from the sky. Just don't be so stupid. These are dumb farmers. But of course, rocks do fall from the sky. But what the intellectuals needed to do was change their view of outer space and the sky. And of course, that's what they eventually did. And then they figured out that the farmers were right all along, and that they were just reporting what they were experiencing. And I think the same is true for all of this paranormal stuff, from near-death experiences to precognitive dreams to telepathic communicate. It all happens all the time. People are just describing their experience, and, you know, people are saying that's not possible. I'm like, that's only not possible in your philosophical framework. Just let it go, and listen to the people, listen to these individuals. And so that's what I mean by weirding religion. Historically, these experiences have been framed religiously. Today, they're not always framed so. They don't need to be framed religiously. They can be framed in other ways. But they are weird in the sense of they don't fit into the reigning paradigm.
There is a reporting issue, though, right? Where you have the farmers. If the farmers are like, hey, rocks are falling from the sky, then they turned out to be objectively correct. But if they were to assign some narrative to those rocks and say, well, the gods are upset because this is happening, and the bells are too loud in the city, and now they're throwing rocks at us, right? The gods are throwing rocks at us. Of course, that narrative would I would hope that we would all say that that's gone a step too far.
Yeah, so would I.
In the
That's
reporting
why
of the,
that's why I don't literally believe religions.
right, of course. In the reporting of these paranormal activities or whatever, how do you sort of parse out what's the rock falling from the sky and what is the, the gods hurling them?
Well, very carefully.
Sure.
It's the joke, or the answer. I don't think we know, Kevin. So let's take the UFO as an example here. I think UFOs are very real. I think people see them and experience them all the time, but I don't believe the gods are throwing rocks story.
Sure.
Which in this case is alien invasion. The story today is these are extraterrestrial ships and they're invading our airspace and they're threats. I'm like, no, they're not. That's just your story. That's just your military nationalist mythology that's going to get you money for the Pentagon or whatever it is you're trying to do. But that's not how African Americans experience UFOs. It's not how indigenous American cultures experience UFOs. It's not how anybody else experiences these. Why should I believe your story? And so, yeah, that's the gods were throwing rocks.
Sure.
And that's what I meant in the beginning of our conversation about this both and. The phenomenon is real, but the mediation is not. The symbolic frame is we need to be very suspicious of.
Wow. Yeah. And I know you said that at the beginning, but now looking back on our conversation, that enters in a very interesting and clear through line for your interests.
And I don't think, Kevin, just to make it even weirder, I don't think that the narrative of the gods throwing rocks comes after the experience. I think the experiences are often shaped by the gods throwing the rocks. In other words, the cultural mythology is not post experience. It's often internal to the experience itself. The experience presents itself in whatever the cultural narrative is. And so there's a kind of trickiness here, or a kind of elusiveness. The phenomena itself is tricky, is elusive. It cannot be trusted. On the other hand, it's happening.
Sure.
So let's be sophisticated about it.
Interesting. But as I think you sort of said earlier, the phenomenon is happening, but it's not happening the way the narrative is purporting. Interesting.
Right. Sometimes I'll say, I don't believe in beliefs, but I believe in belief. In other words,
by that?
Well, that these things are shaped, truly shaped by people's belief, but I don't believe that belief.
Yeah.
I mean, because I can see these same things in other cultures and times, and they're showing up differently.
Yeah, interesting. What is your do you have sort of a model? I mean, do you have sort of I think like in statistics, it's something like the average or the mean is the most basic statistical model that we have, or something like that. Do you do the same thing where, okay, you have UFOs and you have this narrative, and then you have, an ancient civilization that had this narrative that explained UFOs? Do you try to draw the average line, or what do you do with all those as a comparativist? Is that
well, first of all, the average line is almost always wrong. And statistically, of course, the anomaly is always way up here or way down here. It's actually not the norm.
Interesting.
And so I'm most interested in those anomalies. And I think what statistics do is it levels everything out.
Sure.
It levels everything out into a banal norm that I think is almost always wrong. So I'm not a big fan of statistics. I'm not a big fan of numbers, by the way. I think numbers lead us astray. The answer, I think the question I'm hearing in your question is, what do you think the UFOs are? And my answer is, I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not being opaque, and I'm not trying to
Sure.
be clever. What I do know is that people who say they know what UFOs are full of it.
Hmm.
They're either lying or they're grossly misinformed. And so what the people I most trust about the UFO phenomena are always the people who say, I don't know. I don't know what these things are. I'm as puzzled as anyone, but I know they're happening. I know they're part of our reality.
Does that default disposition, does that map onto your disposition towards religions themselves,
Yeah,
where you're
yeah,
sort of like anybody who says that they know exactly what God is, you're like, okay, you're actually out of the conversation.
yeah, it does. It maps exactly on. I think UFOs are religious phenomena. Um, and I think trying to shoot down UFOs is kind of like trying to shoot down souls or spirits. It's a bad idea. It's a really bad idea. Um, I think it's a fantastic misperception of what's happening. I think the UFO has something to do with religion and the soul and the afterlife, and things are communicating with us, but we keep misperceiving it as a military threat or
Hmm.
as a machine in the sky. And I just think, wow, you are so wrong.
Yeah.
Um, but that doesn't mean I know what a soul or the afterlife is. I don't think we do know. And I think, again, I take that seriously. You know, to speak in academic terms, really sophisticated mystical literature is apophatic, by which I mean it takes apart whatever you think of God or ultimate reality. It says we don't know. Apophasis is Greek for saying away. You say away everything. You
Hmm.
deconstruct everything. You deny any kind of objective knowledge for the sake of what's actually happening, which is, again, about consciousness, and that's not an object. It's it's like the eye trying to eye itself. It can't do it because the eye is the eye, and it's eyeing. It's just eyeing, you know.
The you said you prefer the, well, you like paranormal, but you use the word impossible,
Yeah, I
and
do.
of course, science seems
Oh,
predicated on the
sorry, I
idea.
just hit a button.
Oh no,
Sorry,
I
there
can
we
hear you.
go. There we
I
go.
think science, at least, this. I'm trying to square this with what you were saying. Seems predicated on the idea that we have to be able to say what is impossible, right? And you say, of course, that, well, that changes, right? Anybody who says science is fixed sort of isn't truly scientific. That they're just like slowly pushing out in a methodical way.
So, yeah, go ahead.
I think to try to punctuate that question, if it even is one, how do you try to usher in a methodical study of these things, where you said the statistics kind of levels everything? The alternative, though, is sort of knowing every data point very, very well. And of course, it looks like you have a lot of books behind you, but not every mind can do that, right?
Yeah. So for me, the answer is comparison. And comparison basically involves putting as many things on the table as you can.
Hmm.
And I know that's limited, but allowing all those things to shape your conclusions. And I think what science has done is it's taken things off the table that it can't explain
Hmm.
until it gets to this little kind of sliver of reality. And it says, oh, well, we can explain everything. And I'm like, no, you can't. You can only explain what's on your table because you've taken everything off your table you can't explain.
Sure.
So I'm not anti-science. I think science can do all kinds of wonderful things. I think technology can do all kinds of wonderful things, but it can't know consciousness.
Hmm.
Science can only know objects, material objects in a kind of spatio-temporal reality, and it can manipulate that material reality in interesting ways for our own practical purposes, whatever those might be. But it's not telling us anything about consciousness. It can't, because consciousness is not an object in spatiotemporal reality. Consciousness is that which is looking out at spatiotemporal reality and probably creating that spatiotemporal reality. So it's, it's like the projector here. We're looking at a screen in a theater and we're saying, well, we can explain everything on the screen. I'm like, I know you can, but there's a freaking projector behind you throwing everything up on the screen.
Yeah.
What do you have to say about the projector? And of course, nothing. It doesn't exist. That's the answer. I'm like, oh, duh.
Yeah. Plato's allegory of the cave comes.
Yeah, it is.
crashing
It
into
is.
mind.
It is Plato's allegory of the cave, and I'm like everyone else. I'm the prisoner chained to the floor, looking at shadows on the wall. But I recognize there's an outside,
Yeah.
and we're looking at shadows.
Do you think anyone has been dragged
Oh
out of
yeah,
the cave?
absolutely.
Who are those people?
Well,
Do you
generally
have their
those.
names and their emails?
Yeah, actually, I do have some of their email. I actually do.
I would love to talk to them.
Yeah. I think human beings historically have often been dragged out of the cave and seen the light, and they've come back to try to tell the people chained to the floor about what they see. That doesn't go so well,
Yeah. And it didn't in the story, right?
No, and this is what I've been trying to say, over and over again: is please stop taking your view of things on the cave floor as the thing. I mean, yeah, it's something. I guess it's the cave, it's the shadows, but it's just, this isn't reality. It's not what's out there. It's not even out there. It's not reality.
Yeah. I have if again you don't mind me entering into the woo space.
No, I again, the woo space is just a name that secular materialist oriented people call this because they don't understand it and they don't like it.
Yeah.
Because basically what it says is your knowledge is partial and you actually don't know everything. And they don't want to hear that. And so they call it woo to make fun of it. But it's just a rhetorical device. And it's kind of silly at the end of the day.
I think it's a fun word and I use it endearingly.
Yeah, I know you do, but these people who use it, I mean, they do not use it endearingly, Kevin.
Yeah, that's true.
They use it quite dismissively and frankly meanly.
Yeah. And this, I think one of the reasons I use that word is because I know that as soon as I enter into this space, however we want to define it, my language it's just so clear that my language isn't as rehearsed, and there are moments where I don't even feel like I have the words to describe whatever I'm thinking, which is a strange place to be. But let's permit me to be in this space for a second. Do you think there's a modern astrologically aware rewrite of Plato's allegory of the cave?
Yeah.
That might confound us a little bit, where, okay, you turn around, you go up the cave. That in and of itself seems to be a very rare journey for perhaps the best among us. And of course, then you see the light, which is the sun.
Yeah.
Knowing what we know now, there are many, many suns.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So is there a rewrite that we should start to consider when we think about, these layers of truths, or however we want to describe this? Where is there a star beyond our star that we should be interested in sort of a metaphorical way?
Yeah. No, there are lots of people in this space. Again, I have their emails. And some of them, I mean, I really have their emails, Kevin. I'm not joking. I mean, some of them, somebody who comes to mind is Bernardo Castro. I don't know if you've read any Bernardo Castro, but he's a computer scientist and a physicist with now a philosophy PhD. He's Dutch. And he started a foundation called the Essentia Foundation. And he's basically making the argument I'm trying to make, is that, consciousness is consciousness, and it's fundamental. It's what really is at the base of all reality. And what we think of as real is actually not real. It's a projection or emanation of this cosmic mind. So Yeah, I think there are lots of people in this space. I think the zeitgeist is actually moving pretty quickly.
Hmm.
Um, I think if you talk to neuroscientists, for example, who are philosophically sophisticated, they will tell you point blank that neuroscience is never going to get us to an explanation of mind or consciousness.
Hmm.
Because it looks like consciousness or mind is actually not a material product.
Hmm.
They'll say, we can tell you all about the brain. We'll tell you even more as the decades tick by. I mean, we'll just learn more and more about the brain, but it's sort of like learning more and more about your cell phone and never thinking about the internet or the Wi-Fi that it's picking up.
Hmm.
And I think that's kind of where we're at. There are, of course, neuroscientists who think that mind is just brain, period. But I just think they're mistaken. And I think people like Bernardo Kastrup think they're mistaken as well. And Bernardo is, was a hard-nosed materialist, was a computer scientist. So, yeah, I mean, I'm not alone. I mean, I'm strange and weird, but I'm not that strange or weird. I sort of inhabit a group of lots of people who are basically trying to say the same thing.
No, I'm all about it.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting.
Yeah.
So I'm painfully aware of the time, so I want to give us an off ramp here. Although I do get the sense that I could keep asking you questions for
It's all right.
for
It's
a
all
very long
right.
time.
No, it's all right. I appreciate your questions. And I hope you understand. I don't have answers to all your questions, but
No, I love it.
I'm going to tell you when I don't have an answer,
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's alarmingly rare and refreshing in a way. Okay, I'm gonna hit stop the recording, and if you don't mind just hanging on for a second after, and I can
Sure.
sign off and try to get as many of those emails as possible.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you again.
All right.